On the 29th of September, United 24 reported, Putin signs military draft for 135,000 citizens amid ongoing mobilization plans. It's BS. The language used is specifically meant to mislead you. But then we also have the Moscow Times. Putin orders highest fall conscription target in 9 years. Oh my god. Yeah, because 10 to 15 years ago, Russian conscription was much higher than it is today. And 10 to 15 years ago, Russia was not at war. So, what's going on? Oh yeah, I almost forgot. On Twitter, United 24 added the following commentary. Putin signed a decree drafting 135,000 citizens this fall as Russia scrambles to replace massive losses in Ukraine. This is just so dishonest. Pure propaganda. The reality is, at this moment, Russia doesn't conscript anyone to fight in Ukraine. Instead, Russia offers high salaries and large sign-up bonuses to attract volunteers into the military. And when we see Ukraine reports that keep complaining about how the Russian army keeps increasing in size, it seems to work. So let's dive into this story a little bit deeper. But not at this location. I took a little break for you, but I have to keep going. Alright, devolution done. Now, I just have to find a taxi. So, stuff happened and we're another day. No jokes, there's a guy sunning his gooch right below there. I hope he doesn't understand. I didn't think it was a thing here, but it is. Anyway, back to the video. So, Russia is actually pretty open about the number of people it conscripts every year. Typically, Russian conscription takes into account males between 18 to 27 years old, but historically 70 to 80% of the conscripts are between 18 to 20 years old. And typically more men are called up in spring because that's when most people graduate from high school or college. So as you can see, it takes place in draft cycles. So the articles I told you about in the introduction mentioned Russia's biggest wave of conscription in the past 9 years. Something must be happening at the front, right? Well, to see if it's actually a big deal, let's see how many people Russia conscripted historically. So in 1914, no, we're not gonna go that far. In the 1990s, about 350,000 males were conscripted annually. So 20 to 25% of the male cohort of every year. And that was during the Chechen Wars. In 2001, Russia conscripted 383,000 people, of which 195,000 in the fall of 2001. Now, 10 years later, in the spring of 2010, Russia conscripted 270,000 males, and then in the fall, almost 280,000. So we're talking about a total of 550,000. The 2010s is also when Russia moved towards the professionalization of its armed forces. They would prioritize contract soldiers, the kontraktniki, as opposed to conscripts, and there's a very simple reason for that. Russia drafts thousands of young men and train them to become good soldiers, and by the time these guys become proficient, their time is over and they're out of the military, back to square one. So in order to maintain this training and experience, Russia started favoring contract soldiers. Exactly what NATO countries started doing in the 1990s. Except that in the West, most countries got rid of conscription altogether. Now, during the spring of 2016, 155,000 males were called up, and in the fall, Putin ordered the conscription of 152,000 men. So you see, we're starting to notice a sharp drop. Now we move on to the Ukraine war. February 2022, the war starts. In spring 2022, can you guess how many people were conscripted? 134,500. And in the fall of 2022, only 120,000. For a total of 250,000. That's very low. Now, this wouldn't be a complete picture. We still have to mention how in the fall of 2022, Russia mobilized 300,000 reservists. But that's another story. But that's also when Russian authorities witnessed a public backlash, and with huge immigration numbers, people were leaving the country in order to avoid being mobilized, added to a historical trauma of sending conscripts to war. So, for example, the Soviet-Afghan war was mostly fought by Soviet conscripts. 80 to 90% of the Soviet soldiers in Afghanistan were 18 to 19-year-old conscripts. This led to some sort of societal aversion to conscript-heavy wars. Then right after it came Chechnya, with the Committee of the Soldiers' Mothers, which protested the use of young conscripts, literally teenagers, that were unprepared and ill-equipped to fight a war. So Russian society has not forgotten about this trauma. But let's continue. In the spring of 2023, 147,000 males were conscripted, and in the fall of that same year, 130,000, for a total of almost 280,000. The war in Ukraine is dragging on. You would think that Russia would massively conscript more people, but nope. In the spring of 2024, 150,000. In the fall of 2024, 133,000, for a total of 283,000 males. That's also when Russia increased the upper age limit of the Russian draft from 27 to 30 years old. The idea was pretty interesting. They wanted the older, more educated conscripts. In this article, we can read, the general staff noted an increase in the average age of those conscripted into military service. And I quote, the average age of conscripts called up for military service is rising in Russia as more and more young men are taking advantage of their draft deferment to pursue secondary, vocational, or higher education after high school. That's very interesting. That means that historically, most people that went into the Russian army as conscripts had very low education. And since that pool of recruitment is rapidly shrinking because of improved education and a lower birth rate, Russia had no other choice but to find ways to go around this. The general staff data shows that over 50% of the 2025 conscripts have professional education, plus 10 to 15% up from prior years, improving unit quality without full-scale drafts. So essentially, the Russian armed forces want conscripts that already have practical skills, or people with some sort of professional education, people that will be able to make use of the knowledge they have acquired and bring this into the armed forces, and not just 18-year-old kids that are pros at playing Fortnite in their mom's basement, although these can make excellent FPV drone operators. So now, this year, in the spring of 2025, we're at 160,000 Russian conscripts, and in the fall of 2025, so this season right now, we're at 135,000, for a total of 295k. Now, if we're going to make use of selective headlines, we're going to say that it was the highest draft since the autumn of 2011. And then for the fall, we're going to say that it was the highest in the last 9 years. These selective headline tactics are typical to raise alarm bells. But the reality is that 10 to 15 years ago, more Russians were actually drafted into the military, and Russia was not at war. With that being said, yes, Russia is indeed conscripting more men into the military each year, but it's really not that dramatic. So in 2022, with 255k, then we move on to 277k the next year, to 283k, to 295k in 2025. There's an increase, but it's only marginal. We're talking about a 5% increase per year since 2022. If Russia was actually using conscripts to fill in the ranks of its army that was supposedly suffering massive casualties in Ukraine, they would conscript at least double that number of people, not increase by 10,000 people per year. Now, there are other reports that indicate that many of these conscripts are pressured into signing contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense and that are then sent to fight in Ukraine. And this is the story in this article by Vertska, how conscripts are forced to sign contracts. In this article, they talk about 21-year-old Mikhail. He was about to be discharged from military service. And then, I quote, 3 officers pressured him, telling him he faced 3 years in prison under Article 228, Part 1, and that he would be sent to prison. Essentially, the situation is that you have 18 to 20-year-old males that don't know much about life and that suddenly feel trapped in their military service. Then come recruitment officers. They know that these teenagers are very vulnerable to manipulation. And I feel, from what I've read, that they specifically target the young males with single moms, and that probably grew up with a lack of money. I mean, they have the files of every soldier. They know exactly where they come from and what their family status is. Every person mentioned in these articles have the same background, poor with single moms. And what the articles clearly state is that many of these teenagers sign contracts because of their large enlistment bonus and the high salaries, knowing full well that they didn't have that many options once they returned into civilian life. Here in this article, we can read 3 Russian conscripts aged 18 and 19 recorded a video claiming they were tricked into signing permanent contracts in Buryatia. They say, "We signed contracts on July 5th under psychological pressure from a Russian lieutenant." So it is a thing. That's for sure. At the same time, Russian authorities condemn such actions, clearly stating that this is illegal. They only want volunteers that know the full scope of what they're getting into. And there's another reason. these people you pressure into signing contracts will most likely be the first to desert. So the missing information is that we don't know the percentage of conscripts that actually sign contracts after the end of their military service. There's simply zero information. According to pro-Ukrainian media, it's almost 100%. All this conscription is apparently just a scheme to get more soldiers for the war in Ukraine. And from the pro-Russian side, they say it's nearly zero. That it's not really a thing and only anecdotal. So honestly, at this moment, I can't give you an answer. All I can tell you is that Grigory Sverdlin, a director of a human rights agency, estimates that 20 to 25% of conscripts face some form of pressure to sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. But once again, this statement is very ambiguous. So about 1 in 4 conscripts face pressure to sign a contract. But how many actually sign the papers and are sent to the front? No answer. So, hypothetically, if 25% of conscripts sign contracts, that's about 75,000 additional soldiers for the Russian armed forces. But from the data we have, we know that this is only worth 3 to 4 months of recruitment. So clearly, Russia doesn't rely on conscripts to fill in the ranks of its forces in Ukraine. And that's if, and only if, 25% of the conscripts actually sign contracts. Reality is it's probably much lower. Could be as low as 5%. And another aspect is that when you see the actual age of Russian military personnel in Ukraine, it's still much older, in their mid-30s to mid-40s. Visually speaking, we cannot see 18 to 20-year-olds just filling in the trenches. At last, the Kyiv Independent also mentioned how Russia's parliament passed a bill in the first reading on the 24th of September that would introduce year-round conscription, replacing the spring and fall draft cycles. The goal would be to allow continuous intake into the military and smoothing out personnel shortages. So whenever someone leaves the military, another will replace him. Overall, the objective for Russia is to build a larger mobilization reserve. But as you can see, it's still a marginal increase. It's not as if they're preparing to fight NATO tomorrow. Anyway, it's time for me to go to the beach, and I'll see you in the next one.